able to join can catch up on this later. Yeah, and with that, we will go ahead and kick it off. So yeah, just a reminder to adjust your Zoom name as you're coming in. And then Molly, if you want to click to the next slide. Thank you. So we want to start off with land acknowledgement this morning, just to root us and recognize that we are present both physically and virtually in the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples, in particular the Tulalip, Snohomish, Stillaguamish, and Sauk-Suatl tribes. We see you, respect your right to sovereignty and self-determination, and we are committed to being better listeners, learners, and in lifting Indigenous voices, and use this land acknowledgement as a reminder to be pursuing actively relationships that build up and leverage our power and support of the tribes in this area. So next slide. All right. So welcome everyone to our final learning session of 2021, which is very surreal to say. I don't know how you all are feeling, but here we are in December. Feels like things are simultaneously like ramping down and ramping up. So wherever you are this morning, glad you could join us on, on this first Friday in December. So over the course of this year, we focused on various aspects of systems change in our learning sessions, and we thought we'd close out 2021 with a focus on advocacy and policy, particularly with the state legislative session coming up in just a month or two. So it will be kind of more on our minds as we hear about it. There will be more to explore in the policy and advocacy space. So we'll spend a couple learning sessions next year continuing on this topic as well. But for now, many collaboratives are in the phase of identifying system barriers and selecting systems change goals, determining first or next steps and initiatives. And due to the really local nature of collaborative work, whether that's, a town or a neighborhood or a county or school district, the role that policies play in shaping our local systems is strong. So we are focusing today mostly on city and county level advocacy, although we'll definitely sprinkle in some state level stuff as well. And we have our great partners from the ARC of Snohomish County, Rachel and Jake, here to talk to us this morning. So before we get to them though, I want to do a quick checking question. If you want to maybe hit the next slide, Molly, or you can just not share your screen. That's cool too. I can tell you guys. So thank you. So in the chat, just want to be cognizant of time this morning, but in the chat, if you can introduce yourself. I know that we're all pretty familiar with each other's spaces, but if you can just put your name, pronouns collaborative, and then what system does your collaborative primarily work within? Just to get a sense of kind of some of the spaces that we're moving in. You want to type that into the chat, and I can also there you go. It's also in the chat. Thanks, Maria, kicking us off. Good to see you this morning. A long time no see, I feel like.
Yeah, good to see you.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Yeah. So Molly, if you can hit the next screen for the agenda while people are typing into the chat. So our agenda today, we'll hear from, again, Rachel and Jake at the ARC of Snohomish County. Mary will give us another local example, and then we'll have some discussion time. May or may not use the full hour and a half, but yeah, grateful to be here with you all this morning. And then we do have a quick poll at the end too, just to figure out what feels like it will be the next best step. So with that, I can turn it over to Rachel and Jake if you all are ready.
We are indeed. Are we able to screen share?
You should be. Try it.
Excellent.
Let me know if it doesn't work.
Buttons. Excellent.
Perfect. Thank you.
All righty. Go ahead and take it away, Rachel.
All right, so thank you so much for inviting us this morning. Our presentation is on city and county level advocacy. And as Elise said, we are going to sprinkle in some state advocacy as well. So moving on to the next slide. The ARC of Snohomish County fosters respect and access for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families, giving them the power to achieve a full and satisfying life. In more concrete terms, what we really do is we help individuals and families navigate intellectual and developmental disability systems and services. We also have a leadership section where Jake and I and other members of our leadership team help with legislative advocacy and connecting constituents with their legislators, and also with community opportunities on boards and committees. Really what the ARC Snohomish County does is advocate for disability rights and equity, respect, and dignity for all people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Moving on to a focus on local legislative advocacy. Take it away, Jake.
All righty. So Rachel and I tend to very much focus on state level advocacy work. However, it doesn't mean that things don't happen and can be done on more local levels. Now, local level advocacy is very much more about actually implementing the various funding, the various policies and things like that that come down from the state level. So while the state will work on legislation and on most importantly, the budget, they will then determine it. Then it comes down to the local governments to determine how those rules will be implemented, how those budgeted dollars will be spent. And so then the control of that is really given to the local authorities to then determine how to use those projects. Now, one of the key things is as those funds are allocated, they have to be used under whatever umbrella they're allocated for. Now, there's ways you could relate anything to anything, and that is done. But for the most part, like kind of the examples I put here, if there is allocated funding for transportation projects, your city councils are going to be needing to use those funds on transportation projects. Now, whether that is increasing bus routes, working on sidewalk improvements, replacing streetlights, whatever it is, it has to have a tie-in to what that funding is supposed to be for. And this is really important because if cities and counties don't do this and they get audited, there can be a lot of issues with that moving forward. And it's very important that everything be used the way it is intended for. And this is really important on the state level as well, because what that means then is that if the state is allocating money to the city for transportation and it's not being used that way, they're not going to be allocating future money to transportation because it's not being used responsibly. And that's really important, especially if that's an issue that you really want to see that funding for. And before I get going a little bit further, I'm going to be, the example I'm going to be using a lot for this is transportation. This is just something that is always coming up, and it's actually I feel like it's a pretty easy one to kind of explain and everybody can understand. So whenever I say transportation, it's not the only thing. I want to make that abundantly clear, but it's just it's a very easy example that everybody's familiar with and can really help understand these concepts. But having said that, an example of what I want to talk about is Seaview Park in Edmonds. This park was recently renovated in July of 2019, and its renovation was done with an accessibility lens. And that was really important because what happened here was there were a number of parks in the city that children with various disabilities could not use for one reason or another. Whether or not, there wasn't parking, whether or not there was no accessible playground equipment, whatever the issue was, there was a number of parks like this. And so a graduate of the ARC Leadership Development Program that we run here through Snohomish County, Julie Kuhn, actually started going to Edmond City Council meetings to bring up this issue. And so this was her advocating for what she wanted to see this project become. She was going to these city council meetings and she was saying, we need to do this. We need to make accessible parks. We need to make safe places for all kids to play. So that was very much what she wanted to do. That was her advocacy goal. And what she managed to do is get the city council, who was looking at renovating parks. This was a project they were looking at doing. So they had dollars allocated to this. It was a priority for them. This was something they were wanting to do. And what she was able to do with her and her family and community members is to get them to realize that making an accessible park and something that could be usable by all was a priority, because it's something that it's very much the squeaky wheel gets the grease. If there is an issue, you have to bring it up. You cannot assume it's just going to be thought of on its own, because frankly, it's not. And this park was actually quite the project. And they wound up getting $200,000 allocated extra to this project by the city council to help renovate it and create it accessible. And like I said, they finished building it in July of 2019. And here's a couple of photos of the park. And one of the things I want to talk about is, while it is greatly accessible, it's not universally accessible. There's still stairs and things like that on some of the playground equipment. But if you look at it, you can see how wide open a lot of the spaces are between the various playground equipment, especially on the right side here in what are called the hiding spots, which I thought was kind of adorable. And then another simple thing that they did as well is, if you look at the ground of the park, they realized that wood chips were not a surface that was easy to get around on for kids with any sort of mobility issue, whether it is a wheelchair, a walker, a cane, crutches, whatever they needed to move. And so they actually got this poured in rubberized compound instead of just wood chips. And so it's something that's a very simple detail that nobody really thinks about, but that greatly increases accessibility. And you can also see in the background on the photo on the right, the swings. You can see the swing with that orange wishbone shape that's very, very large and designed for larger, and it's designed for larger children to sit in, because there are plenty of larger kids who have mobility issues who need that type of extra support in a swing. And then the large disc swing on the far side there, it's very low. They're very wide. They're very large. And so it's very easy for any child to actually get on there and enjoy the swing, whether or not they're sitting on it like a traditional swing, laying down, or in some other position that is comfortable for them. They also did a lot of work on the parking lot there to make sure that it was plenty of open and plenty wide enough for folks to get from their vehicles to the park, and that there were no curbs that were an issue in the way or anything like that. It's just a lot of little details that went into the thinking of this park and this renovation to really make sure that it was accessible for all. And that was all started by local advocacy at the city council meetings. And that's where a lot of this work can be done, is at those council meetings. Wait, hold on. Actually, let me go back real quick. I wanted to go back one more. There you go. So what I just wanted to stress that again is finding the schedules for these city and county council meetings are very important. They are all supposed to be publicly posted, and that's by law, they're supposed to be publicly posted. So if they're not, you can make some noise about that. And that is where you're going to be able to make a lot of impact locally. And I just want to reiterate again, when it comes to local advocacy, you're going to be wanting to look more for specific projects instead of greater policy ideas, because the greater policy changes are done at the state level. All right, Rachel, let's talk a bit about state.
All right, so the state level is really about the legislative advocacy around the Washington State Legislature and both the House of Representatives and the Senate. So this is the much bigger picture. This is zooming out from county and city level to larger systemic change. So the Washington State Legislature has power over allocating state and federal funds and making policy changes to our laws itself, the Revised Code of Washington and the Washington Administrative Code. And these types of larger, more systemic level changes, yes, they are felt their impact is most felt on the city and county level, but again, that needs to be implemented. And as Jake was saying, the squeaky wheel does get the grease. So the state level advocacy and state legislature is really the first step towards getting that funding in the first place, or getting those policy changes needed, completed and signed into law. So what we at the ARC do is we have a lot of events, and we do a lot of groundwork for connecting individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families to their local legislators in their legislative district. And Snohomish County has 7 legislative districts. And for each of these legislative districts, there are 2 representatives and 1 senator who represent us all down in Olympia. And really a really important part of state level advocacy is connecting with those 2 representatives and 1 senator from your legislative district. And you can meet with your legislators over Zoom or in person. And another way to engage is to participate in community events with legislators. Sometimes legislators schedule their own events to have town hall meetings or something like that that are open for anyone to attend and share their voice. You can also testify at a hearing for a bill that's important to you. And one thing about going virtual is you can testify remotely. So you don't have to drive down to Olympia. You can just be on camera on Zoom for 2 minutes and share why a bill is important to you and why it's important that it's signed into law. And also tell your friends, family, and neighbors to get involved. Moving on to the next slide.
I would just like to add one quick little thing, Rachel.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things too is when it comes to meeting with legislators, while there are, various representatives and senators on the various committees that you might want to be interested in, for example, transportation, you still want to talk to your local representatives and senators, because while they may not be on those respective committees, they still vote. And more importantly, by them being the ones that represent you, you vote for them. So it always means a lot more when they are speaking to people who are their actual constituents and the people who have the ability to either keep them in office or remove them. And so being able to speak with your specific representatives and senator, and specifically if you're able to build some sort of relationship with them and some sort of rapport, that goes a really long way, because they are going to listen to you more than somebody from outside of their district.
Right. And what we do as an ARC is we host events. They're called legislative coffees, where we have like 1 hour with all of the legislators from a particular district and all of the constituents interested in attending. And one thing that was really stuck out to me from one of our last meetings for the 39th legislative district was the legislators recognizing that, and when we thank them, like, thank you so much for coming, thank you so much for listening, them saying, hey, this is our job. We want to listen to you. It matters when people tell us their stories and their priorities, and it makes a difference because it informs the way they vote on certain issues. It informs if they go on the floor and talk about it and defend a certain bill. And so it does make a difference, and it does have an impact. And it's absolutely wonderful to see how the meetings that we have with legislators help connect legislators and their constituents and build that rapport and that connection turning into legislative change that can be felt at the city and county level as well. All right. So as I talked about before, there's funding and allocation of funds, state and federal funds, and policy changes are pretty big themes for state level legislation and the power of the Washington State Legislature as opposed to city and council level changes. One example of funding is a recent Senate bill that was passed into law this past session. This was Senate Bill 5237. And the way the bills are named, they have very long names, but long story short, it's because they have to include everything that's in the bill within that title. So this one is called Expanding Accessible, Affordable Childcare and Early Childhood Development Programs. So the power of the Washington State Legislature was they were able to use the federal COVID funds and decide how they want to allocate those and what they want to fund with that money. So their decision with this bill was to use this money to expand access to high quality childcare, to support childcare workers with more healthcare programs and options, and to expand childcare subsidies. And because this is state level power, they are able to create a new state treasury account called the Fair Start for Kids account. And if we look at another thing that was that brought about policy change, and this was a really big success for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And the ARC of Washington was very happy that this one passed. This is Senate Bill 5284. This was signed into law last session. And this is about eliminating sub-minimum wage certificates for persons with disabilities. Prior to the this law being signed, and but prior to Senate Bill 5284, persons with disabilities could be paid less than minimum wage. This was done through he had to get a special certificate, and this affected about 100 people in Washington State. So this wasn't a huge systemic issue as much as it's going to help those 100 people and create that symbolic victory as well for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities to have more equality in policy and in practice. So this Senate bill was able to amend the revised Code of Washington within its language itself and create that statewide change. So now people with intellectual and developmental disabilities must be paid at least minimum wage for their labor. And contacting your legislators. It is not too difficult. And what we've been learning as members of the leadership team here at the ARC of Snohomish County, it is very important to be in contact and create those connections with your local legislators. There's an easy way to find your legislative district if you don't know it already. You can just Google Washington District Finder. You input your address and then it pops out what legislative district you are in, and then it's easy from there to figure out who your 2 representatives and 1 senator are. Really, one of the most simple ways to contact your legislators is send them an email. Their legislative email addresses can be accessed through the official Washington State Legislature website, or an easy rule of thumb is to just email their first name dot last name at leg.wa.gov. This is almost universally true. I only know of like one representative who has it inverted with last dot first, but that's the exception to the rule. So first dot last at legwa.gov. And so either your legislator or their legislative assistant will reply and help you schedule a meeting. Also, if you want to not do a meeting or just send an email and say, hey, these are my priorities. I'm really interested in supporting people with disabilities. I want more funding for X, Y, and Z, and tell them why and all that. That can be a kind of one and done thing. If you want a meeting, that's also an option. Or if you want to do a telephone call, that's an option as well. Really, what's important is having that connection with your elected official and telling them what your priorities are as a constituent. And one thing too is the meetings with the legislators may also include their LA. So it may be with your legislator and or their legislative assistant. Sometimes legislators are really busy, but their legislative assistants are really wonderful and take copious amounts of notes and send those all to the legislator at the end of the meeting. So even if it's just a meeting with their legislative assistant, it is still incredibly valuable to have that communication. And these meetings can be, if you meet like over Zoom, they're generally around 15 minutes. All right, so these are some tips for meetings with elected officials, whether at the city, county, or state level. This is part of the ARC of Snohomish County's effective advocacy checklist. And this contains 5 really helpful bits of 5 steps to having clear and concise, your clear and concise message getting across, and to really building that connection with effective communication. So the first element is who you are. You would want to include your name, your city, your county, your legislative district if you're at the state level, and any qualifying information. So like, are you a person with intellectual and developmental disabilities? Are you a part of this committee or council or so anything that's related to that helps provide that ethos. So then you would talk about your issue or policy priority. If we are using an example of from somebody who's connected with the ARC of Snohomish County or has an intellectual and developmental disability, you might say, we want, we can just use Senate Bill 5284. We want an end to subminimum wage for people with disabilities. Number 3 is, why do you care about your issue or policy priority? And really going into how does this issue affect you or your community, and telling that personal story. When we have meetings with legislators, they really talk about how powerful and impactful it is to hear that personal story. Because legislators, they have so many things on their plate, and they might not even be aware of that particular issue, much less how it affects you or people of your community. And so for example, if you talk about, oh, this is what it's like to have to deal with ableism as a person with intellectual and developmental disability. And these are the barriers that I face. And this is why this bill would impact the disability community in a positive or negative way. That really provides a lot of context. And that is really invaluable for elected officials to really know how it has a true impact on each person. And then 4, why should your elected official also care about this issue? So this would really bring home, like, this is not an issue that just affects myself, this affects other people. Having an accessible playground for a person who uses a wheelchair to use affects, all people who would be in that area and want to use a playground, but also want to do it without being excluded from those community activities. And what should your elected official do? This really needs to be a clear and concise call to action. As a general rule, you should be as specific as possible. Generalities are somewhat effective, but it's more effective to have like an itemized list of what you want your elected official to do. Do you want them to start a new project? Do you want more accessible transportation in your community? Do you want a new bus stop? Do you want a new traffic light? Do you want a yes or no vote on a state level legislation, state level bill? Or do you want to have a state level bill brought up in a committee? Really get specific about what you want and how you can work towards that goal. And it's always best to develop that connection and that rapport. You can ask for a follow-up meeting or ask if it's okay to send follow-up materials, and to keep that conversation going with an open dialogue and that personal connection component as well. All right. And stay updated on whatever issues matter to you. The information on this slide is specific to the Washington State Legislature website because it's a really amazing website. But this is true for anything at the city and county level. Stay up to date, stay connected, get on email lists, figure out, Google like whatever city you live in and their councils and boards and committees, really get connected and do the research. For the Washington State Legislature's website, you can just type in Washington State Legislature. It's the first thing that comes up. It's a really great website. It has a whole bunch of information. You have all the contact information for all the legislators in Washington and what committees they're on, and as well as resources for what the legislative process in Washington is like, and that step-by-step like overview of how everything works. There's also opportunities for testifying at hearings, and you can sign in pro for a bill, for example, and just having your voice heard in this legislative process and really being engaged with it. There's also this program that is it's streamed through this Washington State Legislature's website. It's called TVW, TV Washington, and it live streams from the House and the Senate and from the governor, and when bills are signed into law, and you can watch hearings as they happen. So it's a really great way to stay up to date on what matters most to you. And a really helpful resource that's part of this website is the bill tracker. If you're on the main Washington State Legislature website, this can easily be accessed by pressing the bill information hyperlink. And you can type in any bill. So if you want to, for example, Senate Bill 5284, and what will pop up is that eliminating sub-minimum wage bill. So this is true for every single bill ever in Washington State. And you can see a step-by-step progress and progression of where is this bill in the House? Is it at its second reading? And just watch as you can read the entire script, the full text of the bill at any time. And so all of this stuff is very transparent. So you can keep very up to date on these bills. And if you connect that back to creating those connections with your legislators, as you follow those bills, you can follow up with your legislators as well and say, hey, I see this bill that is really important to me is in this committee, which you're in. And I'd love for you to support this bill and put it up for a vote and just really explain why it matters to you and your community, and why, for example, it's a good thing to end sub-minimum wage for people with disabilities. So moving on to our next page, there are so many ways to get involved with legislative advocacy, with city and council level advocacy. A great place to start is attend your local city and county council meetings. Get connected with local boards and committees. Snohomish County has, just type in Snohomish County boards and committees onto Google, and it'll come up with a list of openings and all of the types of boards and committees in Snohomish County and what has openings. And it's a great place, a great way to kind of make those connections, get involved, and have your voice heard. For the a disability lens, take part in the ARC of Washington's Advocacy Days. Those are coming up. We have our first meeting for those, I believe, next Monday at 10 a.m. Yep, and you can testify at state legislative committee hearings. So as I was saying earlier, this is really easy to do when it's virtual. And otherwise you can, in other years, people would drive down to Olympia, but it's a bit of a trek. But this is available to everybody, everyone in Washington who wants to participate in the legislative process and share why that bill impacts you in your community and why it should be passed or not passed. Joining your local board or committee is a great way to get involved. For example, touching on transportation, as Jake was earlier, there are a lot of transportation-based committees in Snohomish County. For example, Snow Track, they have their board really oversees the need for change in Snohomish County types of transportation. And I know one of our leaders from the ARC of Snohomish County sits on this board and brings a disability perspective and says, oh, we need to work on this instead, and we need to focus on supporting people with disabilities so transportation is more accessible. So those are great opportunities with local boards and committees to really bring that state level legislation or state level funding down to that local level. And the ARC of Snohomish County does have a leadership training. This is a free training. It's available to everybody in the community. And it's all through the lens of a disability perspective. And it includes a lot of really helpful information about the legislative process and how all of these larger components of the state and then county and city all interconnect. And it's really about advocacy and getting involved in community leadership. We also have legislative updates with the ARC of Washington State. You can sign up for their mailing list. It's really easy. The bills that they are going to discuss are going to be related to intellectual and developmental disability. And Then finally, we have research, research, research. So please get involved with whatever is at your local level, whatever your city is, and see what type of opportunities are available, what openings on boards and committees are available, and how you can connect all of those pieces and work towards making change in your community.
I've got a couple things to add here just real quick. And one of the things I want to talk about is simply the concept of testifying at committee hearings. The language there can sound a little intimidating. And while it sounds like testifying at a hearing sounds like it's something that could be, you know, a little nervous or nerve-wracking, it's just like when Rachel was talking about when you're meeting with your legislators. You want to impart that personal story. You want to talk to them about, like, that is what you need to do when you testify at these hearings. You need to have a hopefully a relatable story that you can convey to these committee members so that they will hopefully side with you on whatever topic you're discussing. I also wanted to talk about that very, very last point there, research, research, research. Rachel made an excellent point earlier when she was talking about the various tips and tricks for meeting with legislators, and as far as how you want to tell that personal story first. And that is extraordinarily important, because legislators and all elected officials, for that matter, are constantly inundated with raw data. And while data is extraordinarily important because it shows you a need, it shows you where money is being used, where money is being misused, and all sorts of other really useful information, it doesn't really relate on a human level. It's not until you hear that personal story. But if you're able to tell that personal story and then have all that data behind it, that is where you really reach kind of this cross section of really putting everything together. And so if you can discuss with a legislator or a council member about the issue that matters to you and tell your personal story, and then you say, and this isn't just me, here's the data that supports this, here's this research, here's this study, here is what we have seen will happen financially, because that's another thing. The very unfortunate thing is most things come down to the almighty dollar. And so if you can find costs for things, and especially if there is any sort of savings, you're far more likely to be heard and listened to just simply based on that alone. There was another point I was going to make on that, and I'm forgetting it at the moment. So.
Well, I can add on that a little bit. Just really the importance and significance of the personal anecdote and personal story cannot be overstated. We've had legislators come to us and say, thank you for organizing the events where they could connect with their constituents, and those constituent stories being directly used to influence and change and bring awareness to certain issues, and to have that follow through with legislators saying that we've used this personal story and these examples that we've learned from these constituents on the floor. We've used it to argue in favor for this bill while thinking about this family and their experience. And that is just really something that's so powerful and speaks to just the importance of getting connected and sharing those stories, because they have so much meaning.
And building off of that point a little bit, we've been told that verbatim by elected officials who remember these stories from their community members, from their constituents. And they were like, I was thinking about that when we were discussing this issue. I was thinking about that when we were discussing this bill. And so it's something that, we're not just saying. We have been told that it is working. It is, people are remembering this, and it is impacting their decision-making process, which is exactly what we wanted to do.
And I remember a particular quote from one of the legislators in the 44th after one of these meetings with constituents. And I quote, he said, "This was the most meaningful event I have ever attended." So your stories absolutely matter and absolutely do make a difference. And it is just something that's so powerful and beautiful, really. Just how much how much change that we as individuals can affect on any type of level. And we want to also include some opportunities with the ARC of Snohomish County for legislative advocacy. Again, the ARC of Snohomish County's focus is on supporting individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. Part of what we do here on the leadership team, as we discussed a little bit earlier, is we have legislative coffees. And these are hosted during the autumn months, and they are for each of the 7 legislative districts in Snohomish County. And these are really spaces for casual conversation and connection with constituents and their representatives and senator about issues affecting the intellectual and developmental disability community, as well as policy priorities. We also offer our free leadership training. This is self-paced, it's all online, and this is for all community members in Snohomish County to learn more about leadership in the intellectual and developmental disability community more specifically. But as we also include a lot of information that is valuable for people from all different types of communities. And this is really about leadership at all the city, county, and state level. At the ARC, we focus a lot of our efforts mostly on the state level and those connections with legislators to get that policy change. And this is because there is a focus on with our larger ARC of Washington State towards creating that systemic change for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And it's we're not going to forget the importance of city and county level city and county level city and county level advocacy in really bringing those changes home. Topics of our leadership training include legislative involvement, community leadership and advocacy, an overview of Washington's legislative process, disability history, disability culture, trauma-informed approaches, and community leadership. We also have a legislative lookout newsletter. This is during the legislative session each year. Our next legislative session starts January 11th. So each week we send out a newsletter with week-to-week updates on bills of interest related to intellectual and developmental disability. And this newsletter, in addition to information about those intellectual and developmental disability related bills, we include information about how to contact your legislators, how to get involved in legislative process, and other important tips and tricks like that. So we have a lot of, again, the ARC of Snohomish County really has that lens of disability rights, and the opportunities we have extend beyond disability rights to helping the community as a whole.
And beyond the legislative lookout newsletter, which we put out through Snohomish County, there's also the legislative updates through the ARC of Washington State. And there is usually a pretty lengthy list of bills that the ARC of Washington is watching and paying attention to, and that they update that weekly. And that list will start being populated soon. The legislator starts pre-filing bills, I think any day now. It's usually the first full week in December when they can start pre-filing bills for the legislative session. And we'll start seeing from those what is going to be discussed and everything like that. And the ARC will go through them, review them, and they will put out an update saying, here's what we support, here's what we don't support, and kind of update where they are in the process. They put together a handy little chart so you can kind of see where things are going. It's pretty handy.
All right, thank you, Jake. And so thank you all for listening to us. Thank you so much for this opportunity to present to you all this morning. We appreciate you. And just we want to give a very big heartfelt thank you on behalf of the ARC of Snohomish County. And please feel free to contact us if you are interested in any of those ARC opportunities from the previous slide. Just shoot us an email and we'll get you connected. And again, thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been really great presenting to you all this morning.
Thank you both. We're so grateful for your leadership in the county around legislation and advocacy, and it is really a gift to be able to learn from you all in that, since this is a space that you all occupy well. So thank you for being willing to share with us. And I forgot to mention to everybody that the ARC is a tremendous partner up at the NCCC Collaborative in Darrington. So that's how they got connected with this crew this morning. So any questions for Jake and Rachel before we allow them to get on with the rest of their Friday?
I will add really quickly. I was just looking to pull it up. I wanted to share it, but it looks like it's not updated yet. The Advocacy Days calendar for this upcoming session, it should be up soon. They have the one from last year, which doesn't do a whole lot of help for this coming session, but that should be updated soon on their website. If you're not familiar with the ARC's website, it's arcwa.org, arcwa.org. So it's pretty simple and it's pretty easy to navigate as well when it comes to the advocacy things. And yeah, there is I know there's a rough draft of the advocacy schedule, but it looks like it's not posted yet.
I do have one question for you guys, going all the way back to the beginning of your presentation. You gave the example of someone who they were working on the playground and showed up at a city council meeting to say, hey, this is a priority, we need to do this. I'm curious then, like, between that point and getting the playground like built, is that something then where city council said like, hey, help us in the design process? Or like, what do you know what that involvement looked like between like bringing an issue to city council and bringing it to fruition?
So I know what happened. I don't know the entire story, but what I know that happened is they got one of the city council members to actually put an amendment in for their budget to do this project. And what they wound up doing was they reached out to community. They had community forums. They had community discussion to talk about, you know, what is going to matter to you? What do you want to see? And that was how they came up with a lot of the various things that are present at that park. I like to keep pointing to the fact that it doesn't have wood chips. It was one of those things where, like I said, it's not something you think about. And then once you actually experience it and realize it, you go, oh, this was a really good idea. This was something that is really going to impact positively, you know, everybody who's able to use this facility. And that was like the type of ideas that came through that process. Now, every city is going to do that differently. You know, you can always push to have those types of community forums and to have that type of community involvement. They are not obligated to do that. Their closest obligation is, you know, people do vote to keep them there. So they want to keep everybody happy, but that's really the only obligation they have. And so by pushing for that community involvement, and most cities in the area want to do that too, because they are there to make the city a better place, to keep the people there happy. And so by involving the community and by keep speaking for, hey, we want to be a part of this, we want to be a part of this, it's going to continue to keep those types of meetings and agencies moving forward. And once they had those meetings, you know, they did all the project stuff that they would do for typically any other project. You know, they came up with some ideas, they went out to and had some bids on designers, and I don't know if it's architect for a playground or if there's a different term, but you know, they basically put out rough drafts, because I've actually seen some of the planning pictures that look very different from the end result. But those were the types of things that they asked about, that had submitted to them, and then they went through that whole process. I don't know how much the community was involved in that selection process beyond the initial, you know, brainstorming phase, but that is what led to the eventual culmination of the project in 2019.
Cool, thank you.
So I have a question. Sorry for the background noise. I'm at a cafe, so if there's music, yeah. I'm curious, besides funding or finances, what are some of the overt barriers or obstacles that you guys face? I've heard of ARC, but I'm not super familiar with what you guys do. So I'm curious as to like, yeah, the challenges and the barriers and obstacles that you guys face on the day to day.
I mean, funding's the biggest one, unfortunately. Washington State is in one of the worst states in the country when it comes to funding for services and supports for the IDD community. My wife was active duty in the Army, and I have a son who's severely autistic, and we have far easier time getting services in Alaska than we have here. And yeah, that still blows my mind to this day. I saw your expression there, Rosemary, but yeah, it doesn't make any sense. But it's true. I'm not too sure where Washington currently ranks. It's in the 40s, though. And so it's the bottom, at best, it's the bottom fifth of states in the country. And so, I mean, there are a lot of other issues, but unfortunately, it does boil down to funding. It is just not properly funded. And what's really interesting is there's a lot of similarities between IDD issues and aging issues as far as wanting service options, whether it's in the home or in a congregate care facility. And in aging, Washington's actually one of the best states in the nation. And it's very disheartening because there are so many parallels as far as services, because you will have discussions with legislators, and I've gotten in a bit of an argument with one about this, that they say we can't do this type of nursing care or this type of 24-hour care that some folks need in the home, yet that's an option for aging services to do. You can have that full-time nursing care in the home. And I see your face again, Rosemary. That's what I was told, and I was this close to calling a legislator a liar to their face, but I didn't. And it's the unfortunate truth. It's all money, and why it's not funded, I honestly couldn't tell you. But I also know that the way they do a lot of their funding is everything is very compartmentalized. Here is the funding silo for aging. Here's the funding silo for IDD issues. Here's the funding silo for mental health. And just because you have to dip into one silo it shouldn't restrict you to that one, because while each of those issues are of themselves unique and different, they do have a lot of overlap. And they're not willing to make that funding overlap. It doesn't make any sense. It's very, very frustrating. It's very confusing. And it's going to be a really interesting legislative session this year, because all of the budget reports keep coming out, and the state is not only not seeing the expected shortfall they were thinking just last year. Last year, they wanted every agency to tell them what 15% budget cuts were going to look like. They're up over $2 billion from their expected revenue from just 3 months ago. Say Washington State is thriving economically is an understatement, and yet we still do not fund the programs, the services, the supports that this community needs. I mean, there's so many other issues. The other biggest one I would say is when it comes to availability of services, they're just simply not there. There is, they're called provider deserts everywhere. Basically, if you go east of the mountains, and you're not in Spokane or the Tri-Cities, you cannot get services. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but not much. And even here in Snohomish County, if you go north of Stanwood, you're not going to get anything until you hit Bellingham. And there's just these massive voids where you cannot get providers, you cannot get services. And so people who go through the DDA process are said, okay, you are approved for these services, you can get these things. You're then put on another waiting list because the services aren't there. And there's a lot of issues that go there. They're not paid enough. The turnover is really high. And then there's simply not places to work because but yeah, that's a question where I could keep going, and I'm going to stop, but it really unfortunate thing, it really is the money. That's what it boils down to. And if you have any conversation with any legislator, at least this year, and they tell you, if they try to say for even a split second that money is an issue, like either call them a liar, slap them in the face or something, because that is not the case for this coming year. That is for sure. But yeah, it's money. It's just money.
I know if I can add a little bit on that. I've done comparative policy research across every single state in the country about developmental disability services. specifically at the intersection of foster care and disability. And what I've learned about Washington State is there's an incredible amount of siloing of services and just policy that doesn't serve the intellectual and developmental disability community at all. That's not to say that it's all bad. There's a lot of change that needs to happen, and a lot of laws that need to be rewritten and to really include the perspective of people with disabilities in them. So I think it really goes to show that some of the laws relating to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities were not written with the people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in mind. And so I think there's all, in addition to arguments about and discussions about not having enough money for things, it's also in the policy itself about getting disability services not being an entitlement. You have to sometimes you're on a wait list, and nobody is entitled to those services, even though those services are essential to living a dignified and high quality life. There's also a societal attitudes component. There's still a discussion about should we put people with disabilities in institutions, and which is something that people with disabilities are really speaking out a lot against. There's a huge public outcry about the human rights abuses of living in these congregate and settings of I mean, I've toured one. They're pretty sobering. But again, we still have people at the state level who are advocating for institutions and that social isolation for people with disabilities, and having this congregate care setting that could be better done in the community with nursing care and expert care in their homes and communities. So there really is that social component and a lot of change that needs to happen, both at the policy level as well as the individual mindset level as well.
And just to kind of build off of that a little bit, one of the things that they actually passed in the legislature, I believe it was in 2019, it might have been 2020, is based on the way the laws were worded. They actually changed it so that you could it was now illegal if you stalked somebody with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The way that law was written, you could stalk somebody with intellectual or developmental disabilities legally. And so like it's very odd that there's all of this language that is in the process of being fixed. There's been a number of bills that have been passed, but unfortunately the execution of that has been very, very slow. And so they keep getting passed again and again to try to speed up that process. But it's just very small things like that. They just add up. You know, it's that stalking bill. That was an oversight clearly, because you don't want to make a loophole for anybody to stalk anybody. I mean, I feel like I can speak for everybody when I say that, but when little things like that keep adding up and adding up and adding up, it becomes this massive issue, and it creates more and more barriers. And Rachel, I can't remember if you made this point or if it was one of our hosts at one of the legislative coffees who talked about how the state systems are like a small house. And when you needed to expand the systems, you expand onto the house. So you build a room off to the side, and they're like, okay, well, now we need to expand more. And so you build another room off to the side, but there's no rhyme or reason. There's no plan. And so you wind up with basically an ineffective structure. And unfortunately, that's kind of where we're at now. We have all of these state agencies that are designed to really provide these services and to really, help these people that need that help, but they're not effective agencies because they can't do what they're supposed to do. And a big reason of that is they've just been kind of piecemealed together over the years. And really everything needs to be rebuilt, unfortunately, because it's just a level of ineffectiveness that is massively frustrating for so many people. Really, the only way people can get services with any sort of speed now is if they're in some sort of crisis. And that's how a lot of Washington systems are designed, is if you are not in crisis, you're not going to get help. And so if you are in a situation where, somebody is in physical danger, then you can get help and services. But it doesn't take a genius to say, well, shouldn't we do something before we get to that part, before we get to that issue, before we have people we're putting on the streets because we don't have appropriate housing, before we're cutting off people's services and any medication they might need, to create these types of issues? obviously not intentionally, but that's going to be the end result of something like that. And that's unfortunately something that keeps happening in this state. And it's just really, really unfortunate because Washington State does a lot of things well. This is something they do not do. I mean, I don't even want to say they don't do it. I mean, yes, there are agencies and stuff in place, but in so many ways, they just don't work. It's, you're trying to fix a car, so you put a horse in it. It doesn't make any sense. It's not going to work. And that's unfortunately how Washington has been addressing a lot of these issues. And yeah, I can rant on that for a long time, so I'm just going to stop.
Yeah, go for it, Rachel.
Oh, but keeping on a more like positive and hopeful lens, with all of this stuff going on, this really speaks to the importance of advocacy work, the importance of making those changes at the city, county, and even state level to create the change that we need, whether we're speaking about the intellectual and developmental disability community or whatever communities you are a part of and want to advocate for. It is really so essential that we continue to fight the good fight and talk with people who are elected officials about what we need done and what will help better the community, because there's a lot of change that needs to happen, and there's a lot of hope for the future for these things to come to fruition. And so advocacy is really about creating that positive future and creating those changes that are necessary for dignified lives for all people, with their human rights respected, and with access to community and access to the life of one's choosing. So that is the undercurrent to all of this, is the importance of leadership and advocacy at every single level of community.
Yeah, and I will say too, while I know what everything I just said was very much doom and gloom, there are a lot of positive steps are being taken. And the good news is the steps back are pretty minimal to non-existent. It's been steps forward. But they're small and they're incremental, because we're slowly trying to undo over a century's worth of damage. And that's the unfortunate truth of this. And so it is a process. It's very slow, which is also a little frustrating, but it is happening. It is moving forward. It is taking positive steps that not just as somebody who's a parent wants to see, but as self-advocates are seeing, as family members are seeing, as the community as a whole, the steps that they want to see being made are being made.
Yeah, I think, one of the key things I'm taking away from this presentation is to, like you said, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So to really make some noise, I think that's something that every collaborative is positioned to do. And we as individuals are, that is what civic engagement is all about. So love the practical examples that you all have shared. And yeah, it feels like there's a lot of good stuff here that collaboratives can step into. So great. Well, thank you both again for presenting, and I'll, in a follow-up email that I send to folks, if it's okay, I can include your email addresses so that, yeah, people can reach out if they have any more questions. But yeah, with that, thank you both. And yeah, feel free to stay on if you would like, or feel free to go enjoy your Friday and weekend. Yeah, so next, we did ask Mary Wysocki, who many of you know as the collaborative coordinator for NCCC, the collaborative up in Darrington, to share a practical example. Just again, wanting to get, our goal with these learning sessions is to get really practical. And so Mary has held roles prior to NCCC with the county and with other community groups and organizations, and does a lot of advocacy herself for the IDD community as well. So just asked Mary to share an example for folks. And then we have some discussion questions that we can head into as well. So Mary, feel free to take it away.
Oh, thank you. That was a great presentation by Jake and Rachel. I just want to make comment that I have gone through their entire leadership. And while it is very specific to disabilities, it's just really valuable for the resources and also kind of the coaching of how you do it when you go down to talk to a legislator. So it's really good, excellent training, and it's online and you can do it at your own pace. So I recommend that if you or even any of the families that you work with are interested, it's a great starting point. So while that was really heavy on the legislative end and the billing around bills, I'm just going to talk about kind of the practical pieces of working on the ground level and all the connections that we make with the families. And I just really quick want to say that when we're speaking with legislatures or working with them in any capacity, they really don't want to hear from the professionals. I mean, they do in a sense, because it's important that they hear our feedback, but they really, really, really want to hear from families. That's, that is life-changing in terms of making or breaking a topic or a bill. So just want to emphasize that. So our NCCC 3 years ago, the collaborative made it a priority. And one of the gaps was that there was not quality internet services up in Darrington. And so that affected a lot of people. And this is pre-COVID. So there was not the connectivity. It was expensive. You'd get kicked off during meetings. And it was just really a problem, especially for our community because it's very isolated. So the collaborative made it a priority to try to look at ways that we could bring in a quality broadband up into the area. So Darrington Internet Users Association was a local group that came in and said, hey, we can start with the working with the contracts, the construction, all the things that we need to do to start laying the groundwork for bringing in broadband. And it's a very complicated topic. So just so you know, I'm probably not using all the correct lingo, but it's a big project. So NCCC gave Darrington Internet Users Association a lump sum of money to start working towards that. As they were going through, they were coming into different challenges with laying the line, and then also getting the licenses needed for the construction and the materials. And so as a result of that, Darrington Internet Users Association went to United Way, and at the time Lark was in the lead position, and she had connections at the county level, and said we need to bring this to the county level so they understand the importance of it, and that there was going to be a vote through, I think it was through PUD. So because United Way got involved and was our backbone in a sense, we were able to go to the council and tell them the issue that was taking place that was blocking us from moving forward with the project. As a result, council voted in favor of PUD to, I can't sure if it was release a license or renew a license or some type so that the construction could go forward. So that was in year one. And then in year two, we have a local group of family members called Darrington Family Outreach, and they are families that are in our program up there, and they represent a lot of the families up there. They live there. And we actually invited Nate Naring, who is our District 1 county rep, up to speak to them, and they shared with him at the time that connectivity was definitely an issue. And this is right, again, pre-COVID. So you can imagine how exacerbating the problem has been now with COVID. But anyway, as a result of that, they were able to sit down and just share three things with them. There was a lack of law enforcement up in Darrington. They were really struggling with the connectivity. And I think the third thing, it's been a while, was housing, affordable housing, but I can't remember 100%. Anyway, as a result of that, Nate Naring went back, and we sent him a thank you card. It was very encouraging for the families to be able to share that with him. And then after that, Nate Naring, Councilman Naring, started a statewide task force or countywide task force with support from the state on different federal and state funding for broadband. As a result of them sharing with him the need for broadband, they invited myself and then a representative from the Darrington Internet Users Association to be on the task force. So again, through that, we just keep making these connections. And while we are still now in year 3, we still have moved very small steps, but we are making progress. For example, the school district today is meeting with Representative Eslick to talk, the 39th district, that's where we sit with, to talk, and she's going to talk about broadband and, you know, the effects of not having broadband for the students up there. And then I will be having lunch with Carolyn Eslick next week, and I will be talking to her again about some of the federal programs that are coming down the way, some of the funding streams that are coming down the way. So I guess in that long example is that the follow-up and the relationship building, and just kind of keep tapping at your topic and following up in every aspect of the work that you do around advocacy. So just keep at it. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. We're on year 3. We're still plugging away. You know, we haven't made a lot of progress, but we're making progress. And so that's the encouraging piece. And again, having the lived experiences and the family voices at the table definitely is what's a real deal breaker. They want to hear from them. Any questions on that?
I was just going to add real quick too, Mary. I mean, thank you for sharing.
Uh-huh.
It's always cool to hear you be like, oh, we called up Representative Naring. And I'm always like, man, that is so cool. You can just be like, oh yeah, Nate knows us. And we have built a relationship with him. But I believe, Ashley, it was Representative Eslick who just contacted Ashley with the library up in Darrington, also to get some input from families for the broadband connectivity issues. So
just a quick correction there. It was actually Congresswoman Susan Delbene, not Representative Eslick, but yes. Thanks, Elise.
Yes, Congresswoman Delbene, also great. So.
And I just really quick want to say that, you know, the work that Jake and Rachel, all the advocacy groups are doing and the families are doing to educate legislators, it's a slow process. And so that's why I'm really grateful to have United Way as a funder and as a partner who understands that system change takes time, but also working with legislative, the aspect of legislation, it takes a long time to change systems. And so I appreciate that they've been committed for the long haul, because it doesn't happen quickly.
Thanks, Mary, for sharing. Yeah, so we heard a lot of great information from folks today. It went definitely longer than we thought it would, which is totally fine. So it's 12:15. We did have some breakout rooms planned with questions, but since we only have 15 minutes left and it's a smaller group anyways today, we were thinking we could maybe just glance through the questions in a big group format. Molly can give a quick, so we have, some of you may be familiar with the policy work group that United Way, Snohomish County, we've been working with representatives from the collaborative. So she can give a quick update on that. And then we can just take a couple minutes to look through the discussion questions, recognizing that we don't have a ton of time left, but see where we get.
Absolutely. So if you were part of some of the policy work group meetings in October, this will sound a bit redundant, but I'll just kind of do some context setting for folks. United Way has done a policy and advocacy committee for years, and just like our core work, it has evolved, especially over the last couple of years as we think about how that fits our current work. So it used to be a work group committee that was community volunteers that were unassociated with our funding, or weren't in current partnership with us. More like a collection of board members, who are uninvolved in the work in other ways. And it used to be setting state policy priorities for, the issues and the populations we were working to impact at the time. That's changed since we moved to core work. It's been policy priorities around families with young kids living in poverty. And then last year, we started changing it to not just, the core population in general, families with kids 0 to 8 living, in poverty in general, but actually what's going on for core families specifically. So last year was the first year that a bunch of the collaboratives got together and designed that list of policy priorities. And so we're kind of narrowing in on what our policy and advocacy focuses on and who it impacts and who it's designed by. So last year we did a Washington State legislative agenda focused on the needs of core families in 2020. This year, we kind of took it a step further and said, just like Mary has said, just like the folks from ARC said, it's not enough to get together in the fall and just write a policy agenda, hand it off to our lobbyists and have them do a bit of work during session. These are really year-round relationship-based, issues and work, and just doing state legislative stuff is not really going to move our collaborative work forward. And so this year, a policy work group with 4 of the collaboratives represented in it got together to talk about what are the shared needs that we're seeing across the county for core families, regardless of what collaborative they're interacting with. What are the issues that are coming up most often? We found a lot of shared agreement around early learning, housing, mental health, basic needs benefits, legal support, things that are impacting, the hundreds of core families that we're interacting with across the county. Then we got to talking in our second work group meeting around what do we want to do with that. So we are going to write a state legislative policy. The work group decided that it would be around early learning this year. But then also starting to design like all the things that happen, around that. Is it impacting the state, how state funding gets used? Is it around relationships? Is it around getting families connected to things that are already, exist and are funded? Is it advocating for accessibility or affordability of childcare? What are all the different pieces and what levels do they happen at? Just like folks have said already, yes, there can be some benefit to people in the legislature or, other folks hearing from our lobbyists. There's more benefit if it's from us. It's even more benefit if it's from you all, and it's even more impactful if it's from families. And so we're thinking about how to support all the collaboratives in just having ongoing continuous relationships and contact with all levels to get, advocacy moving forward. So we have capacity to support both the collective issues and then also whatever policy and advocacy issues each collaborative would like to work on specifically.
Great, thanks. Any questions on that? You can always email questions if they come up for sure. Yes, Arhelia?
Yeah.
Is that a hand up? Yeah.
Yes. So when we are talking about supporting this work and the policies, and I'm gonna go back to the list that you have in there in housing and specific, because housing and specific means a lot of different things for all collaborators, right? And I'm just gonna use Homeward House as an example that we're focusing on that child welfare system, and we're trying to keep the mother and child together, right? So our housing might look really different what we are seeking, than what is for CCC, because they're serving the whole family with no involvement of systems, might be some of them. But there's so many already house bills going around, that has to do with housing. There's so many for mental health. Are we seeking to start something the United Way is gonna lead and start a new House bill that really fits the need of this core collaborated, or we are seeking to just join the fight that somebody else is already doing for a couple years now? So that's my question.
I think it can be both. There's a wide range of, like you say, issues that are important for collaboratives, but also the amount of resources and connections each collaborative has. So I don't know that everyone is on, ready to start writing their own legislation. If a collaborative is there, let's run with it. If they're not, let's start by at least joining the fight that's already going on. We can do bill tracking and set up opportunities for collaboratives to testify. We can help, build relationships. And, one of the things that came up in policy work group is how can we be using the collective voice of all the partners and families involved in the core collaboratives to be, advocating on city and county level stuff. The example that came up was there's state funding for rental assistance, but at a county level, there was a decision made that it shouldn't go to mortgage assistance, and that's negatively impacting NCCC. And so, are there issues like that where we can start by getting together in all the collaboratives and writing letters to, county human services or county council folks? So I think it can be a variety. We can build capacity in joining the fight. And then when people are ready to start articulating, new legislation and, kind of at that level, great.
Thank you, Molly. I think it will help a lot to know, and this is a very good time to do it, right? To start knowing about what was passed on the last legislative agenda. They had to do with the issues that we want to support and what is it that still is going to be revisited this year.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you want to do that, but I can bring what I know Washington Park, which is related to child welfare services. What is pending from last year that there is still thinking we're going to give it another try this year. But there's also the housing piece, right? Because there's so many that pass and there's so many that are being passed right now, like the 1590, December 15, I think is the upcoming, right? Hearing at the county about that bill, if it's going to pass or not. So yeah, I think that could be a good start, right? To kind of have at least,
yeah, we can get that together and kind of do a summary of what happened this past winter and what it looks like starting in January. Oh man, I totally had another thought, lost it, never mind.
All right. Well, Molly, while you're potentially fishing for that thought, the other thing that comes to mind too is what Jake and Rachel mentioned around like following city council and county council and boards, that what they're working on and what committees are, what's swirling around committees. But I think an example from this last year, maybe the last 2 years, it's all a blur, is with ISA. Housing Hope and Everett Public Schools had come up with a really lovely idea for building housing in Everett for students experiencing homelessness and their families. And City Council decided to not allow that to happen. And I think and also implemented some city ordinances that have really been very detrimental for folks experiencing homelessness within city limits. And so I think that's another example too of like, that's housing tangential, and it's also a city council level thing. So I think that as much as we can have eyes on the different levels, in addition to seeing kind of what's happening at the state, looking to at the city and county seems like it will be helpful as far as making as much noise as we can up front.
I thought of the thought that I lost. It was that, part of what the work group talked about in October is exactly what you're saying, Argelia, that it's good to kind of think of the context of what just happened in last session and then what it's going to look like this year. And that was one of the reasons that the work group kind of wanted to look, instead of picking a bunch of different priorities to focus on, to pick one, but look at it more holistically, to say, okay, the Fair Start for Kids Act just passed. There's potential, Build Back Better action coming, which if it happens would include things like, universal preschool or other early learning related things. It's great that Fair Start for Kids was passed, but that is not the end of the issue. There's implementation, there's funding, there's going to be local action that comes out of that. And so that was one of the things the work group had talked about is, okay, how do we kind of focus on one issue, but see it through and be able to work on it on different levels.
We're coming up on the end of our time. So Maria, if you'd like to go, and then I can wrap us up.
Yeah, just really quickly, I just want to provide a practical example on joining the fight. So I work in every community college. I support undocumented students. And so last year during the summer, we started working with job strategy. At first, just to, it's an organization that works, develop bills and goes through the legislative process. So we started to involve students, to let them know that, or, show them how they have a voice and how can they use it. And specifically undocumented students, because they wanted to pass a bill the bill 9154 that has a lot of components, but one of them for undocumented students and to be able to receive financial aid and be considered to be Washington State resident. So the bill was going to change from living 3 years to 1 year, to have a high school from Washington State, to have a high school, in here or anywhere in the world. But the most important thing, I think it was that they were listening to the students directly. And it was so impactful for our students to be involved in that, it was very impactful in the way that I realized that their voice mattered and they can move the needle. And, and thankfully the bill passed, and that changed a lot of, lives in people that live in our community, in the state, but, so I realized that even though like myself, probably I'm not very knowledgeable about the process, but it's evident that, that if we want to do system change, we need to be involved and learn how to do it.
Thanks, Maria.
Yeah, we have such an opportunity to amplify what is going on with families and being able to, put them front and center to design and advocate for what is best for them. We can help that along. And just like we talk about programs not being the end all be all, programs help us identify what barriers and what areas we want to do systems change work on. Maybe this year it's joining the fight, and that experience shows us the barriers and gaps that maybe we want to fill doing our own legislation in the future.
Great. All right, well, it's just after 12:30, so we had discussion questions, but thank you for the conversation that we have had unprompted. I'll probably just send those discussion questions out in a follow-up email as like, in case you want to be thinking about that on your own, no pressure, but just so you have that as a resource for additional thinking together as a collaborative maybe around this topic. We do have a quick poll to see where you all want to go next in these conversations about policy. So I'm going to just launch that real quick. And if you can just, oh, I probably should, well, it might not be the best poll in the world. I probably should have made it multiple choice. But if you want to pick your kind of highest priority area that you would like to learn more about with advocacy, go ahead and fill that out. Great. Awesome. So yeah, it's looking like county and engaging folks with lived experience are coming up as having the most interest. So we will look at that for our the next sessions that we do. We can look at focusing on that. And if you guys have any other ideas or thoughts or things that you want to learn about, please email me, email Molly. We want to make these as relevant and practical and helpful as possible. So I always appreciate your feedback and ideas, and anyone you want to hear from, let us know. All right. Well,
Really good to see you all.
yeah. Thank you
Thanks
for
for
spending
being
your
with
Friday
us.
morning with us. Have a great
Thank
weekend.
you.
Happy holidays, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.